We continue with mixed reactions on the Constitutional Court ruling. The Apex Court referred the decision on Zuma's parole back to the Correctional Services Department to determine if Zuma needs to go back to jail or not. For analysis on this story, I'm joined by political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze. Professor, very good evening. Appreciate your time. Talk to us about the significance of the Constitutional Court's ruling regarding Jacob Zuma's return to prison.
Well, I think what is important is that they stated very clearly what is the situation in terms of law, the South African law specifically, how the medical parole must be determined, the role of the National Commissioner of the Correctional Services, what can be the role or the influence of the National Commissioner in that, for example, to overrule what the advisory board of the medical parole board has decided. And in this case, I mean, they went very far in stating that actually setting aside that, or confirming, concurring with the decision of the Supreme Court of Appeal of setting aside the decision by the National Commissioner. So that in terms of the law, I think makes it very clear. We go back, for example, to the situation many years ago of Shabir Sheikh, also about medical parole, which became, created the sense that medical parole is a type of a political decision. And I think here it is now the court sort of reinstated what should be the case in terms of how medical parole should be understood.
Well, Professor, let's rewind a little bit and let's talk about how Zuma initially secured his release on medical parole despite not meeting the requirements.
Yes, that was the medical parole, the advisory board on medical parole decided based on the evidence that they received from specialists and other medical evidence that President Zuma did not qualify for medical parole and therefore should continue with serving his term in prison. Then the National Commissioner at that time, Arthur Fraser, is a former Director General of Intelligence also. He then decided to set that aside and granted medical parole for President Zuma in September of 2021. And then President Zuma continued with medical parole until the end of the term, or that was he supposed to serve. And that was September last year.
So all of this is squarely in the Commissioner's lap, if you will. Now, what role does the Prisons Commissioner play in determining the remaining period of Zuma's incarceration, if at all he's going to be incarcerated?
Well, the court judgment by the Supreme Court of Appeal in the first instance and now confirmed by the Constitutional Court is that the separation of powers between the judicial judgment by the courts and the executive implementation of that must be maintained. And therefore, it is back to the National Commissioner of Correctional Services to determine whether that period that President Zuma was on medical parole will be incorporated or counted as if he served his sentence. And therefore don't have to go back to prison. And whether or not, because I think the complication is that both courts concluded that that decision by Arthur Fraser was illegal and unconstitutional. But when it comes to the National Commissioner, his decision is not supposed to define the law. It is to determine how that prison sentence must be served, in which form. And that is where the discretion of the National Commissioner comes in. So it is whether the fact that President Zuma served medical parole, which means he wasn't released, he was still in a different form of serving it. There were some restrictions applied to him. For example, if we think back, he never could attend any of the political events or meetings leading up to the National Conference of the ANC last year because of the restrictions of the medical parole. Whether that is sufficient to be regarded as a form of serving a sentence, or whether it was immaterial for this situation.
Well, it would seem from the Court's judgment that the Commissioner has some latitude in coming up with the decision of whether to incarcerate former President Jacob Zuma or not. Now, let's talk about other factors. I mean, there has been talk that part of the reason it's unsubstantiated, but that there could be chaos if President Zuma were to be sent back to prison. Is this likely to be a consideration for the Commissioner, or are there any other factors that could be considered by the Commissioner?
Strictly speaking, the Commissioner should only consider factors that deal with the Correctional Services component of it. That means serving of the sentence, the conditions under which it has been done by President Zuma, whether that can count as a form of serving of the prison sentence, and not so much the social or external political factors. But undoubtedly, it's going to play a role. And I think the National Commissioner is in a very difficult situation because he is not an active politician, was not supposed to be, but inevitably there's going to be political pressures on him, as well as knowing the potential destabilization that can take place based on what we've seen 2 years ago. What we've also seen lately, for example, is the burning of the trucks. Many people are believing that that's linked to the 2-year anniversary or the 2-year period since that events in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. So it reactivates the relevance of that for the current situation. Over and above the fact that there is a sense of social instability, that there's a sense that there's lots of pressure on the public, on South African society in general, and that any external factor can serve as a catalyst for some explosion. So I think these are the sensitivities that the National Commissioner, even if it's not acknowledged as factors that will be taken into account, will most possibly indeed be taken into account.
Professor, I have a thought here. Now, if the government went to the judiciary and asked them to make a decision on a pending case, that obviously would be considered interference and is not acceptable. Now, if the government takes a look at what happened 2 years ago with the massive looting and rioting that occurred, and they went to the Commission and said to him, take this into consideration, would this be interference?
Yes, it will be. The powers of the National Commissioner are clearly determined by different legislation, and this decision that he has to take is part of that. And therefore, any form of influencing by the President or by the Cabinet or by the Minister of responsible for Correctional Services, Mr. Lamola, will be regarded as political interference, because there is also a distinction between the responsibility of the executive on the one hand and the responsibilities of administration, the non-elected administrators, officials, and that will be a transgression of that distinction between the two.
Now, considering the timing of the ruling, are there concerns, I imagine there are, of potential violence or unrest following Zuma's potential return to jail? So there is pressure on all the arms of government. In your view, what does government do? What do the police do outside of being ready? Do they allow this to happen potentially if there is a link?
Well, they will have to be in a position to prevent any form of violence, any form of unrest, any form of illegal activities that as a result of something like this. I think given the experience of 2 years ago, they are in a better position than then 2 years ago. They should be much better prepared for it, that it happens. And therefore, I think it is for them to be able to be preventive in nature, the actions that they will take. In some cases, that can be by a show of force, just in terms of the presence of police and military maybe even. But it is not that they can take action. It is therefore the furthest they can go is to prepare and to implement preventive actions, but not more than that.
Well, Professor, I don't know how prepared you might argue they are. We've just seen the torching of close on 20 trucks, if I'm not mistaken, and that suggests that there isn't a state of preparedness, that there wasn't intelligence to establish that this was happening. So potentially, if the same was likely to happen, then I'm not entirely sure that we'd be prepared. But my next question really is around Zuma's daughter, Dudu Zuma Samavuta, who's contributed to the current discourse surrounding her father's case by posting a number of tweets. Do you think this has an impact? What do you read into it?
Yes, she has been involved, well, 2 years ago also in this situation, and as I understand it, there were some investigations about it, no action taken yet about it. But it is, I think we can expect that the family and persons around President Zuma has been activated now by this judgment of the Constitutional Court. They will be very active on social media and more, and maybe even within communities around them. And they will use this as a way of bringing back President Zuma, because politically speaking, President Zuma to a large extent disappeared from the scene, especially since last year's National Conference of the ANC, where most of his supporters were not elected in the positions for which they were nominated. So this can provide a comeback opportunity for some of the Zuma supporters and President Zuma himself, although there's still other court cases that's continuing in which he's involved. But he had some setbacks lately. For example, the private charges that he laid against Billy Downer and Karen Moon against President Ramaphosa himself, that was set aside by the courts now lately. And then the fact that his own court cases are still continuing, that hasn't come to an end. So that means that there's still a lot of pressure on him. But I think this situation is one which he will possibly try to use in order to try to galvanize public sympathy for him. And that there might be quite a response in favor of that for him.
Professor Dirk Kotze, appreciate your time, and he was unpacking the Court's ruling that former President Jacob Zuma must go back to prison.